Hello there, mortals. I am Ynsin, and I've just solved the hidden lore behind the game Sheepy, a short adventure. Now, before I get into the video, yes, this is my first theory, and yes, it's inspired by Matpat. I've been watching Matpat's YouTube channels for the better part of a decade now, and I saw recently that he's leaving YouTube, hanging up his hat so that he can raise his family, which is fair enough. I'm going to miss him, but now's as good a time as any for me to stop watching theories and start writing them myself. So this video's for you, Matthew Patrick. Retire in peace. Sheepy is one of the latest free games to drop on Steam lately, and it's definitely worth money. You can play it for yourself on Steam or watch the playthrough on my channel. It's incredibly well made and definitely worth your time. The sound design is incredible, the graphics are incredible, the game itself is incredible, it's just worth the hour spent actually playing it. More to the point of the video, Sheepy definitely has an adventure to follow along with, but there is some super hidden lore which tells the entire story of the game, whether the developer, Mr. Suicide Sheep, likes it or not. So of course I found a secret, and then my brain does what my brain does, it reaches into the deepest recesses of my knowledge, and then pulls something really cool out. Now before I get into the theory itself, I'll just have to show you a secret that I found, because the secret was the thread that I pulled that led to the whole shirt being unraveled. In the third level, appropriately named Revelation, if you go through the mines and find all 6 hidden levers on the level that are marked on a screen in a not-so-secret computer room, you'll light up the 6 lights on this randomly placed doodad which opens the blast door beside it. The blast door holds a collectible disc and a lore tape. You need to hear the tape.
The crystals, they did not form here naturally. I'm bringing the data to you now.
Who's the researcher? Who is the dark evil entity? Who is Sheepy? Now, it might not seem like it on the surface level, but this tape is filled with lore. First of all, it introduces who the corpse next to the tape is, a Scottish expert in crystal research who just discovered that the crystals that the level is filled with were not naturally occurring. This is very important. You probably also noticed those 5 strange letters at the end of the tape in the subtitles. A-U-I-M-E. If so, good eyes. If not, I'm diving into that right now because I've already figured it out. When I first came across this weird set of letters, I brushed it off, but it bothered me. So I did what any game theorist would do in this post-Matpat theory world, and I sat on the toilet with my phone, obsessively Googling it for anything. And nothing came up, until I went to Google Translate. Now, Google Translate isn't amazing to find information from, and mostly can't translate language syntax or even get a true translation for words. But it would be exactly what I'd use to translate an Easter egg secret into a dead language if I were an indie game developer. Putting AUIME into Google Translate and asking it to detect the language, it picked up Latin, and given that the game mostly takes place in Paris and literally has French people in the credits, I translated it to French. The translation is allons-y. If you've been on my channel or streams for a while, you know that I love this phrase and that it translates to let's go, but is more fun to say than let's go. You know, like, let's go, baby! It then sounds like, allons-y! It rolls off the tongue better. If that's the point of the AUIME secret, I'd be very disappointed, so I kept poking around. Putting a space between the A and the U auto-translated from Scottish Gaelic to English from the river. Not only is this much more appropriate, but it's also not a disappointing troll. Since we know the researcher is Scottish from her accent, and if you've never met a Scot before, just trust me on this, my bloodline is 3/4 Scot. It's much more likely that her final words would have been in a language that originated from her home country. Also, as a Scot, I should mention that this translation is entirely false and is just made up by Google, but so is the allons-y from Latin translation, so both translations from either dead languages are just as likely as each other. If I were a AAA game studio, I would have hired somebody to translate it into the language. If I were an indie developer, I would just rely on Google. I mean, it's a free resource. Now that we know this nameless Scottish researcher exists, we can start wondering why she's there in the first place. I have an idea about why, but first you need to know about Belgian Industries. Belgian is a company that built the large modern structures across the first half of the game. And it's very clear that Belgian comes from big money. Whatever it was that they were doing, it had an enormous amount of funding. The company mine is less like an actual mining facility and more like a citadel with many different branches of industry across the whole complex. Belgian hired the Scottish researcher. Since we actually find a shipping receipt from what Belgian is exporting from the mines, I think it's pretty safe to say that in the absence of precious metals and gemstones, Belgian were exclusively focused on mining these strange crystals. For whatever motivation Belgian had to mine these crystals, they sure as hell didn't know what they were doing or what they'd found, which is why they hired this researcher to figure out what the crystals do on site. And that's who the researcher is. Just a hired consultant by a large conglomerate company. More importantly, why she's in that room with the blast doors is because she was the first person to figure out exactly what the crystals are, and she was killed for it. Now, it's important to know what she was a specialist in. Let's circle back to the AUIME secret and the reference to from the river in Gaelic. There are a few types of crystals that have direct relationships with water, but only one really fits the bill. Liquid crystals. Yeah, like you'd find in a TV. Now, I have done a lot of research into what liquid crystals really are, and the general consensus is that you need 40 years of chemistry education to get the bare minimum of liquid crystal concepts. After lots of poking around, I found that a common denominator to understanding liquid crystals was to familiarize myself with a concept called quantum critical phenomena. Essentially, this was where I was led to. This is basically the everything you need to know about understanding liquid crystals. And as you can see, it's absolute gobbledygook. I do not know what I am looking at, and I can almost guarantee that you at home also don't know what I'm looking at. Like, what the hell is this? That is such a long equation! This makes absolutely zero sense to me. Like, come on. What is this? What does this even mean? What is this? This doesn't even make sense. I'm pretty sure that this one right here is just made up. There's not even any numbers in this equation. Yeah, at least in the second one, there's a 2 every now and then. But again, straight up, there's just no numbers. And actually thinking about it, there's very few letters as well. This is supposed to be a tutorial according to the URL. And 7 pages in, you're just bombarded with all of these Greek letters and strange waveforms at different melting points and stuff, which actually further reinforces the point I'm about to make. As confusing as all of that looks, I can certainly tell you for a fact that liquid crystals are a bit of a phenomenon in chemistry, as they shouldn't exist. Liquid crystals also have multiple melting points, and if you heat a liquid crystal from a solid to a liquid, depending on how fast it cools, you could end up with an entirely different solid crystal as an end product. And no, I'm not ripping a definition off of Wikipedia. I literally spent 10 straight hours looking into what liquid crystals are, and that was the bare minimum of what I got. Very confusing. So confusing even that the liquid crystals are listed as one of the 4th states of matter, which categorizes the theory of liquid crystals under quantum chemistry. Paradoxically, there are actually examples of liquid crystals occurring in nature and was accidentally discovered around the turn of the 1900s by a scientist who wasn't even a chemist. That research was taken over by someone who actually was a chemist, and that chemist dedicated his entire life to specifically studying liquid crystals. Now, given that not only had Belgian hired a specialist in crystals, but also their otherworldly properties, I'm convinced that the crystals in the game are liquid crystals. The only issue is that the researcher's dying breath is that they did not occur naturally, and given that quantum chemistry is inherently unnatural, and that it's very clear right from the start that Belgian were not the first people down in this mine, we're going to start drifting away from science and more towards mythology. We understand the purpose of the researcher, now let's move on to the actual theory. When we first came down into the thoroughfare and into the Belgian complex for the first time, we ride a small elevator pass down some ancient architecture. I can tell you right now that it doesn't take a genius to look at the architecture and think of Romans. After all, the aqueduct systems around the cave were invented by the Romans, which also puts a very vague date around when the Romans first found this cavern. Aqueducts were invented by the Romans as a form of getting water to irrigation way away from water sources. The very first aqueduct was built in 312 BC, and after the fall of the Roman Empire, almost all of the aqueducts were then dismantled by barbarian hordes. By about 530 AD, there were virtually none left standing, albeit a few very famous aqueducts. Now, between 300 BC and 500 BC is an enormous amount of time to put our time frame in, but we can further narrow it down. Given the architecture styles of the huge building in the background, it's also very similar to Greco-Roman architecture, which is most certainly earlier than 530 AD, and was generally used as a standard in architecture from 500 BC to 200 BC. Greco-Roman architecture generally relied on pillars holding up a large roof base, instead of post-Greco-Roman architecture, which generally use archways in door frames to increase the amount of strength, which then increased the load that could be placed on top of the doorway so you could build higher. which is why in Greco-Roman architecture you see lots of tall buildings, but you don't see many multi-levered structures with these pillars. It's just not functional. By about 100 BC, straight pillars holding up a gigantic rooftop were considered decorative, so they were only really used for vanity projects instead of actual structure. However, looking at the building in the background of Sheepy, when we go and descend into the mine, we can very clearly see that the pillars are almost entirely structural. This, coupled with the existence of aqueduct systems, narrows the Roman discovery down to around about 100 years between 310 and 200 BC. It could also be likely that the aqueducts were built later, but the architecture of the building was definitely out of date by 200 BC, which definitely puts a hard stamp on that. So now we're getting into Greco-Roman mythology, and if we poke into the of the river theory, then there's no more famous a Greco-Roman river than the river Styx. There are also 4 other rivers that people don't really know about because Disney hasn't made any movies on them, but for your education, there are 5 rivers of the Greco-Roman underworld that constituted for the underworld's post-life system. First, in the Greco-Roman afterlife, you would find the river Lethe, the river of oblivion. You'd have to drink from the Lethe, which would make you forget your mortal life, and thus able to continue your afterlife. Then there was the river of Cocytus, the river of wailing, or if you've read Homer's Odyssey, the river of lamentation. This is where your soul would go if you hadn't been given a proper burial, and you'd be cursed to wander their shores forever. The third river is the Phlegethon, which is literally a burning river of blood that leads down to Tartarus, which is super metal. More importantly to this video, there's then the river Acheron, known as the river of misery, and of course the famous river Styx, the river of hatred, which was not actually a river, but a goddess. The river Styx was said to circle Hades 7 times, and this separated the underworld from the living world. Styx also may have been a river, but was also a titan and a gatekeeper to the underworld, specifically into Hades. For clarification, Tartarus is not Hades. A lot of people think that they are one and the same. They are not. The Phlegethon leads to Tartarus, which is kind of like the 7th layer of hell, and the Acheron and Styx kind of border Hades, which is just hell. There's also disambiguation between Hades the place and Hades the person. Hades the place was where damned souls would go, and Hades the person was hilariously a capitalist bureaucrat way before the invention of capitalism. Which is a funny note to think that the Greeks literally saw hell as capitalism. I'd love to see what they say now. Now, back to the rivers. Lots of old sources also state that the river Styx was overrun by the river Acheron, so the Styx and the Acheron are essentially the same body of liquid. Styx and Acheron are also very important to this theory, but we also have to know about the Greek death burial rites. In Greco-Roman mythology, there was a system in place for the afterlife, where you had to have been given a proper burial, which included either 2 coins over each eye, or a coin under the tongue, to give to the ferryman Charon for passage across the rivers Styx and Acheron. If you couldn't pay Charon the fee, you were doomed to wander the shores of Acheron. Charon was often depicted as a hideous and greasy troll, and as far as history is concerned, was a parentless orphan. Now, if you Google this, you will find information that conflicts with this orphan claim on the internet, as it's common knowledge around mythologists that Charon was the son of Erebus and Nyx. But this information comes from a Renaissance fanfic titled Genealogia Deorum Gentilium by Giovanni Boccaccio, who has essentially pulled all of this information out of his ass by noting the similarity between the names Charon and Kronos. Giovanni Boccaccio also posted this genealogy about 1,000 years after the signing of the Edict of Milan, which decriminalized Christianity and kind of made it a more popular religion than any of the old ones. So 1,000 years after the Greek religions and gods had essentially died. Aside from another unverified source called the Lexicon of Hesychius that claimed Charon is the brother of Uranus, there is no classical source that verifies any of Charon's family. A lot of Greco-Roman mythologists also speculated that Charon was more Egyptian than Greek, given the unusual name. All of this information leads to the sound conclusion that Charon was immensely isolated and only served one single purpose: to ferry souls across Acheron to their judgment and never see them again. Well, Charon was isolated except for one single constant friend. Charon had the sole company of Styx, who was not isolated and came from a huge family of titans. Styx was the eldest daughter of Oceanid titans Oceanus and Tethys, married to the titan Pallas, and had plenty of little titan children, including Nike and Kratos. No, I'm not joking. Now, some of the levels in Sheepy are very clearly inspired by Christian naming conventions, including Revelations and Purgatory. This would lead us to believe that Sheepy lives in a Christianized world, and a common belief of religions is that the gods do not cease to exist just because nobody believes in them, but instead lose their powers over time. There's also the level apotheosis, where you essentially learn the truth about the evil entity and yourself, which is an out-of-character Greek term compared to the Christian terms, meaning summit or climax. Coupling the use of purgatory with the context I've just shown you, I believe that the place that Belgen has set up its gigantic mining station is nowhere else but in the Greco-Roman underworld, where the rivers Styx and Acheron would have been before they dried up. With no more souls being put to rest in the Greek way, Charon would not be rowing his boat back and forth, and the rivers would solidify under the extreme climate change of the last 2,000 years. Charon, with nowhere else to go, would have stayed at Acheron with his friend Styx. This is why the crystals are being mined. Belgen had uncovered the river Styx, and are processing the crystals into something that, in the context of the ledger of Achilles being dipped in the river Styx, could provide inhuman protection, extended life, or potentially even immortality. But one of the crystals was not like the others. Our Scottish researcher corps was called in to figure out what was inside the crystal that didn't perform like the others, and after melting it down, released Charon from his rest. Charon, who'd been stuck inside of the mythological embodiment of hatred and misery, as well as being trapped with all of the lost souls who couldn't pay the boatman's fee, was then released into the world, bound by liquid crystals caught in a state between gas and liquid. This would allow him to fly, but also manipulate objects too. And the radio static that we hear every time one of the characters die is radio interference. If you've ever made a phone call beside a microwave, you'll know radio interference. It is the world's least harmful form of radiation and is caused by the vibration of particles. If Charon can fly, chances are that his atoms are vibrating at a hell of a rate, and that would cause radiation, which would disturb an electronic recording device, like the ones that we listen to all across the game. Charon, the lonely boatman of hell, is the dark energy that serves as the game's antagonist. So, who are we? Who is Sheepy? Well, Charon wasn't the first soul released, and let me explain. Across the game, there are clearly two types of crystals, the blue and the red. The red represent Charon, but the blue would have to be another spirit who had been down here all this time. A spirit that potentially has connections to the blue of the ocean. By pure chance and luck, the idiots in the mine at Belgen released Styx from her rest. They didn't know what they'd released, but Styx manifested and flew around, leading Belgen to call the specialist in the first place. Styx tried to warn Belgen of Charon's tainted soul by possessing Patches, but Patches was stabbed in the head by a scared employee who just saw a stuffed toy animate and run around the compound, which honestly is probably fair enough from the human's perspective. Styx fled to figure out another way. Eventually, Charon was released and lashed out by systematically killing every person he could find. After Charon's rampage had completely eliminated everybody who worked at Belgen, time passed and Belgen became overgrown, until one day, a plush sheep was discarded down the garbage disposal of Paris, and that's when Styx found her opportunity. Styx doesn't want to hurt her friend Charon, but knows that he needs to be stopped. That's why Sheepy doesn't ever actually attack. Eventually, the path leads Styx up into the level titled Apotheosis, which hardline ends the trend of the Christian level naming, and fulfills a prophecy by trading in her powers to open a portal to another world. The last level in the game does actually appear to be fairly out of character as well, and is more reminiscent with Norse mythology rather than Greco-Roman or Christian. During the final boss fight, Patches separates himself from the evil entity of lost and damned souls from the river Acheron and defends Styx from the darkness inside of them. I believe that Patches is then Charon, who has let go of his anger, spite, and army of damned souls, who he would have been stuck with for all that time. And the evil that fights Patches and Sheepy after Patches gains autonomy is actually the embodiment of the souls who are cursed to wander the shores of Acheron even after it dried into the crystals. Once we, Sheepy, and Patches both sacrifice our powers to open the portal, Sheepy, or Styx, I believe, drags Patches, or Charon, into the portal and leaves the mortal world behind. So now that I've answered pretty much everything that confused me in the first place, I just have one more question. What is up with that portal? Well, I believe that the portal is a reference to the Midgard gate to the Bifrost, which is the Nordic rainbow bridge between the realms. If you've seen Avengers, you'll know about the Bifrost. The Bifrost is essentially the bridge to a bunch of different worlds, all located in a ring with Asgard directly in the center. And with all of the Greek gods fading into obscurity over the last 2,000 years, Styx and Charon have no other choice than to find refuge with the Asgardians in the realm of gods, where they belong. Anyway, that's it. Just tied a nice little bow on top of Sheepy, which was a masterpiece in its own right. This has been one of my highest effort videos to date, and is my first scripted video. But I had lots of fun doing it, researching it, writing it, and I really hope you liked watching it as much as I like putting it together. Now, I doubt that this theory is going to be endorsed by the developer of the game, Mr. Suicide Sheep, and everything that I've said in this video is really just my own interpretations of what I saw. I tend to overanalyze everything that I can, given that I have a medical condition called hypervigilance. Hypervigilance basically kicks my brain up into overdrive every time I'm doing something. Now, if you yourself have any theories for this game, which by now you should have played, it's only an hour long, then go drop them down into the comments. I actually do read all of my comments, and I'll pin the most interesting ones to the top. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Right up here, you are going to find my playlist of game theories. This is my first video, so you might have to wait a wee while. And right up here, you're going to find another playlist that I think you'd really enjoy. Just over there, that's my subscribe button. If you do that, Snoot, you go a long way to helping a small YouTube creator and his journey to content creation. And until I make the next video, thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one. Goodbye!